Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Hanno Sauer. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And today we're talking about his new book, Moral Teleology, a theory of progress. And I'm also leaving a link to our first interview in the description box of this one. So Dr. Sauer, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me second time. Good to see you again, Ricardo.
Yeah, likewise. So let's start with this then. What is moral progress?
Let me perhaps start by saying that the book is open access. You can just download it. You don't have to buy it because it was like I have this project where the funding requires that you make stuff available open access, which is crazy expensive for the project, but it's free for the reader, and I think that's quite nice. You can just download it and check it out if you want to. Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's really been this big recent trend when it comes to people thinking about and writing about moral progress, moral change, those sorts of questions like does morality have some sort of progressive character? How do our values change? What are the mechanisms that drive it? There's been a real surge in interest and attention regarding this topic, and so I kind of wanted to see whether we can come up with an interesting angle on this topic. And I thought, there's this like teleological thesis, the idea that history maybe is like biased in a certain direction that has a certain trend or trajectory that no one wanted to go near to. No one wants to defend this idea because it seems too outrageous, too spooky, too metaphysical to people. And so that got me hooked on this idea. I kind of fell in love with it a little bit, and I wanted to do my best to defend that idea. And of course, as you said, you kind of want to know what moral progress is conceptually before you go into that question of, well, is that thing, once you know what it is that thing headed in a certain direction? And I think in the book, I operate with this very, very kind of disappointingly simple concept of moral progress. Is that moral progress, if you ask me what I mean by that, I just mean that things get better in a moral sense. Right, so it's not a different. It's not a definition. It's not by any means. It's just like zeroing in on the phenomenon, and I think the reason for that is that when you look at the existing literature on moral progress, and much of it, like I said, took off recently, a lot of people kind of confuse the concept of moral progress with substantive criteria for moral improvement. So they kind of smuggle in these criteria into the alleged concept of moral progress already. I think we need a thin concept of moral progress. It's just like improvements, but not any improvement. It's not technological improvement, it's moral improvement. And then once you separate that out conceptually, then you can start thinking about, okay, what are the mechanisms that drive it? What are the institutions that you need to sustain it, to stabilize it, to promote it? What are the normative criteria that you need to identify it when it happens? But I think conceptually it's very trivial. It's just like there's one point in the Critique of Pure Reason where Kant says, actually, explaining what truth is pretty simple. Truth it just means that you say things are the way they are, right? You just but that's not a theory of truth. It's not a criterion of truth. It's just what truth means, right? So if you were trying to explain to someone who doesn't speak the language what truth means, you would say, well, truth is, things are the way they are. Say that things are the way they are. And I think it's like that for moral progress. If someone asks you, what do you mean by that? I would just say, well, it means that things improve along a moral dimension, and then we can start talking about the other things.
Right. But I guess that one of the reasons why I asked you that question is also because there's at least one complication when it comes to claiming that something got better or there was an improvement, because when it comes to moral philosophy and particularly metaethics, not all people are moral realists. And so one of the main critiques here, just to begin with, is that some people would say Yeah, but what do you mean by things getting better or things improving? Because I'm not a moral realist, so that means nothing to me. I don't think that corresponds to anything real in the world. The only thing that I see is moral change, but that's not the same as moral
Yeah,
progress. So
yeah,
what would you reply to that?
yeah. So I think there is this very common assumption that, especially when it comes to ethics and moral philosophy, perhaps also political philosophy, is whenever you want to talk about improvements in that domain, moral improvement, that kind of talk commits you to a kind of like realist position or realism adjacent position in metaethics. So any talk about moral progress, that's the assumption, has these quite burdensome and quite metaphysically demanding implications when it comes to your metaethical outlook. And I don't think that's true. I think in general, you can talk about improvements in all sorts of domains, including ethics and moral philosophy, without being committed to these metaphysical facts. I'm not saying that realism is false. I'm just saying that talking about moral progress and improvement doesn't commit you to any form of metaethically demanding moral realism. We can identify improvements in technology and innovation and improvements in the economy, productivity, GDP, and so on, without having like an objective truth about what the most advanced technology is, without having an idea of what sort of a perfectly developed technology level at the end of history would be. And I think it's like that for moral philosophy as well, is we are, and I think indeed we should be, operating in thoroughly non-ideal territory when it comes to this talk about moral improvement. There's no commitment to moral objectivity in any strong sense. I no longer know whether I myself would classify myself as a moral realist or non-realist, because I basically think that the whole field of metaethics and the kind of fundamental way that it thinks about things are moral facts like facts, or are they like subjective reactions, emotions, and so on and so on. I think that whole way of thinking about what morality is and how it exists, if it exists, that whole way of thinking is totally misguided. I think that's complete shadow boxing, and I think morality is a real phenomenon, right? But that's, I think, something that non-realists in the traditional sense will agree with, right? It's sort of like religion is a real phenomenon.
Yeah,
and you can study it. It doesn't mean that the entities that, according to religion, allegedly exist, like divine entities or souls or angels, that they exist, right? So at the very least, obviously, at the very least, you can study morality in that sense as a real phenomenon. But then I also think that morality is real in another sense, which is that morality is just the thing that, one of the main things, perhaps the main thing, that human beings use to organize their living together, to organize the way that they coordinate their actions, they cooperate in order to generate certain mutually beneficial interactions, and that's what morality is about. So in a certain sense, it's human made. So it's in a certain sense, it's a constructed thing. It's not lying around in the world like stones or fundamental forces of nature, something like that. It's not something that you just discover, and that it's not something that's been around before humans were around, right? So in that sense, it's non-realist and it's constructed in a way, but it's constructed in a way that's it's not like it's arbitrary or optional for us to have morality. It's not arbitrary, optional what it is about, and so in that sense, this is more closer to a kind of realist position. But again, I think the whole way of thinking about the whole field of metaethics, in a way, as it's been done, let's say in the second half of the 20th century up until now, the whole field is just completely based on misguided premises. It's just not the right way of thinking about what morality is and how to study it.
And we'll probably address some of those issues while going through the questions here, some of the topics you explore in the book, because I guess that many moral philosophers are still not very much into things like anthropology and evolutionary theory that are probably very useful to reframe the way we think about human morality.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, philosophers for the longest time have, prided themselves as being sort of the experts for the general, right? So usually you have experts for specific domains. The philosophers are supposed to be expert for the general, and in order to be that, you have to avoid getting into the nuts and bolts of the other sciences, right? Anthropology, psychology, economics, biology, political science, and so on and so on. And what philosophers have done, and analytic philosophers are the worst in that regard, the main culprits, so to speak, is to say, well, in that case, we basically have to use this armchair approach. We have to try to use methods of a priori investigation of this as if those existed. And it basically just meant that they were doing conceptual analysis, which means that you think about what sounds right to you, how you use your concepts, and I think that method is almost comically bad. And I think it's increasingly started to dawn on people that that is just not a method that gives you any deep insight whatsoever. We've had decades of grown men and women trying to define the concept of knowledge unsuccessfully, and when you try to explain that to an outsider of the discipline, they think that you've lost your mind, or we've lost our minds. And so I think that we very much need to embrace this turn towards, some people call it synthetic philosophy, trying to remain in dialogue with whatever other disciplines are interesting to philosophy, and try to but make it a genuine dialogue, right? So reciprocal learning and exchange. And in my experience, many people, if you do that earnestly, they welcome it. And psychologists or anthropologists or biologists are interested in that kind of philosophical craft of making very subtle distinctions, trying to introduce clarity and so on. And so these are, I think, all good things. And yeah, so I think that philosophy in general, maybe except for some of the formal subdisciplines in philosophy, but there too you have huge dialogue with mathematics, for instance, formal disciplines in general. But almost all of philosophy has to be done in genuine dialogue with the other sciences, and bring in any kind of information that's relevant to the topics that we philosophers are also interested in. And that includes ethics and metaethics, and that's what I've been trying to do for the past couple of years.
But there's another question that people also ask when it comes to moral progress, that is, if it is even possible. And I mean, is it possible? And if so, how can we know that?
What do you mean by possible? You mean like physically possible, or was it possible in what sense?
I'm not necessarily physically, but if moral progress is something that can happen. I mean, if our moral values can become better, if there can be moral improvement at all or not.
Okay, that's an interesting question. That's a great question. It depends a bit on what you're looking at, right? So I think there are quite a few people who are reluctant to accept the idea that there could be moral progress, because they think that, well, human beings don't really improve. It's always like, each generation starts afresh. And I think there is some truth to that, right? Human beings are, there's the crooked timber of humanity, out of which a straight thing was never made. And that remains true. And human beings are, in some sense, the moral quality of each individual doesn't really improve over time, right? But I think that that's not the place where moral progress happens, if it happens anyway. Yeah. So I think moral progress is not about improving individual humans and their psychology, not really. What it's really about is it's a shift in the moral performance of social institutions over time, that get people to produce more morally desirable results, and all the kinds of things that we would like to see: inclusion, equality, improved well-being, decline in violence, whatever your thing is about moral progress. All of these things don't really happen because bottom-up human beings improve in some way for some reason. It's because there is this intergenerational push in a direction of moral improvement, and the individuals are kind of swept up in that dynamic, but they're not driving it. They're really sort of like following it, but it's happening at a supra individual, institutional, extended social mind kind of level. So I think that's what makes a lot of people reluctant to accept the idea that moral progress is possible, because they think that for moral progress to be possible, what would have to be the case is that human beings improve in the sense of individual human beings and their psychology and their mind. And they are right to say that that's not really happening, but they are wrong in making the assumption that that is where we should look for progress if we are trying to look for progress. What we should look at is our socially extended mind, our institutions that make us behave in certain ways, and it's much more powerful than any shift in individual moral psychology could ever be.
And we'll talk about some of those institutions later on in our conversation. But tell us first about teleology. So what do you mean by teleology here? Because just by hearing it the first time, it sounds very much like a religious concept, like some sort of supernatural thing occurring here. But can it be a scientifically credible thing?
And you're right about that. You're right about that. So what I'm trying to do in the book is try to see whether we can come up with a kind of teleology 2.0, right? A form of moral teleology that is not spooky, it's not metaphysical, it's not religious, it doesn't require, a world spirit guiding history, but a teleology that can be made coherent with naturalistic commitments, that there isn't anything weird and transcendent and metaphysical in that sense going on in the world. And so I think that when we start to think about what could a version of a teleological theory be true, we also first need to settle on what we mean by that, right? Now, I think in general, when you look at all of humanity and its history, the teleological thesis used to be quite popular, right? Usually, what you find in various different cultures all over the world is some version of the idea that we used to live in a kind of paradise kind of situation, right? Way back in the day. Now, right now, the present times, and maybe one or two generations back, it's all chaos and decline and hard work and misery. But there may be some one day there may be a kind of return to the golden age, and we just need to kind of wait it out. Or we need to wait for, I don't know, the Messiah to help us out.
Perhaps one of the ideas that we most commonly hear about, at least in the West, is the idea of the decline of the West, which is actually not something recent. It's been around for centuries probably, but nowadays people are again talking a lot about that, about the decline of the West, and sometimes they associate it in recent years with concepts like wokeism and stuff like that. So that's I think what you're mentioning there, right?
But that's exactly right. But it's a very common thing civilizationally in general, that it seems to be like the past was glorious, the present sucks, and there'll hopefully be a return to a renewed time of glory. So much of thinking about how the trajectory of humanity goes for the longest time has been teleological. That doesn't mean it's true, of course, by no means, but it used to be a very, very common idea. And even those who say that society is in decline, they have a kind of teleology, right? It's just that the goal is bad. Right? They say history is headed in a direction. It's just not one of improvement. It's one of further decline. And it used to be this very, very popular, but now mostly forgotten book by Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, Der Untergang des Abendlandes, that was very, very popular before the Second World War, for instance, the Weimar Republic and internationally. But that idea has been around for millennia, and it's a very, very common theme in how cultures think about themselves. Now, ever since, of course, and I think this has been a genuine scientific improvement, of course, ever since the second half of the 19th century, especially with Darwin and a credible alternative to teleological explanations of life and organisms in biology, right? You had this idea, that was like the major final blow to teleology, was that you can actually even explain many of the basic facts about living organisms and the way that they appear to be like organized by a designer. You can explain a lot of that without recourse to any designer or intelligent plan whatsoever. It's just random variation and selection that gives you that, right? And that was read, I think justifiably so, by many people to kind of end the idea of teleology once and for all, right? It was kind of, the idea was like the last big teleologists were maybe Hegel and Marx, right? And so Hegel and Marx, they were like the final, Hegel in the first half of the 19th century, and Marx a generation after that, but still basically before Darwin in many ways, right? As far as the concepts are concerned. And that was like the last big attempt to tell a teleological story of history, either like Hegel with an objective world spirit guiding humanity into moral political perfection, right? Like this end of history theme, or with Marx, you had the idea that it's materialist, and you have the forces of basically material forces and the relation of the productive forces and the level of the institutional setup of these productive forces, property, relationships, and so on, driving history also into a kind of final state, maybe of classless society and a communist vision of society, something that would succeed capitalist modes of production. But then after Darwin, all of these narratives about how society works and where it's headed, and that you could figure out in advance where society is headed. So it's not just that you tell that story once it's already happened, but you can kind of decipher the laws of history before it happens. Right? So you sort of like say, this is where it's going, right? 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And that's been thoroughly discredited, and I think justifiably so. So these kinds of narratives are no good. And what happened was that made people think that that's the only kind of teleology that you can defend, right? So people have always tried to say that teleological accounts of history are thoroughly discredited forever because they have taken this indeed implausible, super strong version of teleology and thought that's the only game in town, right? And it has various elements. So one thing is that teleology for many people means that, first of all, history has an end state, right? So we are headed towards not just in a direction, right? It's not just like non-arbitrary, but we are headed towards a final state of perfection, right? An ultimate goal of history. And I think that that's not true, right? But you can talk about the trajectory of history and the direction of history without being committed to the idea that there is a final end goal of history, an ultimate state where history will conclude and be sort of definitive and over, and the rest will just be, no significant change anymore. I don't think we need to say that. I think we can just stick to the idea that there may be some non-arbitrary direction to it. And the second thing, there are many aspects to it. A second thing is that teleology was usually taken to imply the idea that, and many people say that there are iron laws of historical development, right? So you can identify not just what the ultimate state of perfection is for society, but you can also, like I said, decipher, like a natural science, you can decipher in advance what the laws are that govern this move towards this final end. And I don't think that's true either. There are no real laws when it comes to how history unfolds, right? It's just not that kind of thing. It's just not how humans operate and how humans work. Another thing that people thought teleology implied was that there is maybe some sort of agency behind it, right? Maybe it's God.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the proletariat. Maybe it's the objective spirit, right? And that's the kind of thing that makes history happen over and above the involvement of normal human beings. Right? But I don't think that's what teleology implies either. Teleology, if you can defend it at all in some way, will be a thing that, or the direction of of social change and the way that it's biased in a certain direction, will be something that is taken care of by normal human beings and not by some superhuman being, or by some super being, or sort of like a force of history that reaches through normal human beings and their institutions and their social movements and so on and so on. So I think there are just a lot of assumptions that people thought had to be connected to the idea that history could be structured teleologically, that I don't think we need in order to say that social change is biased in a certain direction. We don't need a final end state of moral perfection. We don't need a supernatural being that takes care of it, that's kind of like the puppet master of history. We don't need to be able to have laws that govern how history changes. We don't need to be able to identify in advance what these laws are and where society is headed. We can instead understand the teleological thesis as the thesis that there are forces in social reproduction and change that bias that change in a direction that is not morally indifferent, but it's not headed towards a final end state of perfection. There are no laws of historical change, no real laws of historical change anyway. It's not done over and above the heads of normal human beings. And it's very, very difficult to figure out in advance. And I think that's how we should think about moral teleology. And then we can start talking about, okay, do we see evidence for it or not?
Okay, but do you think that we can still talk about, we can also talk about moral regress? Is that something
Oh
that
yeah, for
can
sure.
also happen?
Yeah. That's another thing that was associated with the teleological idea in history, is that it's basically a done deal, right? So it's
Mhm.
basically like guaranteed. It's bound to happen that we are developing in a
Yeah.
certain direction, and I think that's very clearly not true. We're not bound to move in a certain direction, and I think that is something where indeed a look at the 20th century is very useful, and that's what impressed people a lot about
Yeah.
the 20th century, justifiably so, which is that, oh yeah, this idea that technology and politics will just progress ever further and further, that seems not to be true. Usually, when you have development in a positive direction, some people are not going to like it. Some people are going to hate it very, very intensely.
Yeah.
Any development in any direction usually engenders some sort of backlash. And sometimes it can happen that forces coagulate in a certain moment that makes these forces of backlash and regress very, very powerful
Mhm.
all of a sudden, right? And maybe that those forces gain political influence a lot, and like it happened with the Nazis, for instance, and other fascist movements in Europe, for instance. So that's a real thing, and I think that's an insight that we need to keep embracing, is that either way, there's no guarantee that there won't be any regress. It can either come from inside, when you have political movements that say we need to return to the past, we need to, men need to go to work, we need to stay in the kitchen, that was great.
Mhm.
And we need to return to that allegedly glorious past.
Yeah.
That's something that happens, and there's always going to be a fringe in any normal conservative movement that embraces those ideas, and they can become
Mhm.
very, very powerful, and sometimes they take over, and we should safeguard against that, because that's not a good
Mhm.
way of developing in general. So there's no guarantee that even if you think that kind of like naturalized teleology 2.0 is plausible,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean there are any guarantees that society will develop in a certain direction.
Right.
And there's always backlash. There's always the potential for regress, and in some cases, that regress can be pretty catastrophic.
Mhm. But talking about that possible regress, that backlash you're mentioning there, reactionism more generally,
Yeah,
there's also this idea, and because we're talking about morality from a naturalistic perspective here, and including things like, for example, our evolved psychology, there's this idea very common among conservatives, and here I mean, many times people are mostly referring to political conservatism, but it's also moral conservatism, because separating really I mean, political conservatism from moral conservatism, I don't think that really works, also because politics is not really separated from morality. But that would be another
yeah, I
entire
agree. Yeah.
discussion. But anyways, there's this common idea among conservatives that and some of them are reactionary, because they are reacting to progressivism or moral progress occurring, that conservatism is superior to progressivism because supposedly it is much better rooted in our evolved psychology, more attuned to our human nature, and basically that we should be careful when trying to negate that supposed fixed human nature and stretch it in ways that will not work in the long term. I mean, do you think that this makes any sense? And how do you square it off with the fact that we still have an evolved psychology?
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, but it's false.
Mhm.
I mean, it makes sense in the sense of like, I understand what this is supposed to mean, but I think when we put it like that, it's in almost all cases either false, or it's a kind of like bait and switch kind of situation where people try to argue, well, there are some limits about there are some limits of social and political change, or on the speed of social and political change, right? And then they try to get you to accept that idea. And then once you've accepted it, they try to say, that's why that kind of improvement, the political improvement that you're suggesting right now will never work, right? And that's not the same idea. So I think the first idea is kind of plausible, or like there's a version of it that's plausible. And the second idea is something that is you should not confuse with that. And I'm not against, you know, a rational type of conservatism and all elements of it, but I think we need to be very wary that that's often a trick that's being pulled, is that people try to get you to admit that there are some constraints on social and political change, and then they try to say, well, then it follows that abortion should be illegal. Right. That's not really what you should. So and like you said, conservatism can mean, like, you know, capital C conservatism, like whatever the Republican Party in the US, right? So a particular type of political conservatism. It can also mean something entirely different, and it can also mean like a philosophical tradition, Burke, Oakeshott, and so on and so on. And I think that's interesting, and that's worth talking about. Now, there's also this version of conservatism that you, I believe you have in mind, which is like evolutionary conservatism, right?
Or at least political and moral conservatism that takes advantage of ideas coming from evolutionary psychology, for example, to make a case for social and moral conservatism, which is not necessarily what evolutionary psychologists themselves defend. I mean, perhaps a few of them, but not at all the discipline, the entire discipline, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. But here too, you see, for instance, people try to say that there are certain ways of running society, maybe certain ways of inclusion or cosmopolitan living, that is just too far away from our evolved psychology. Our evolved psychology is tribal. It's us against them, and that's how we need to live, right? And they try to get from that to, we need to let those immigrants drown in the Mediterranean Sea. Right? That's not what people are saying, but we should, for instance, have very, very strict laws against immigration or something, or strict policies against discouraging immigration, right? And that supposedly follows from facts about how our mind evolved. And I think that almost never works. It doesn't work because it's just too far of a leap, but it also doesn't work because of the kind of being that we are. Our psychology, I do think that evolutionary psychology is a serious field, but I think the constraints that evolution imposes on our psychology and our cognition and our feeling and motivation and so on and so on, while they do exist, we just are, due to evolution, very, very flexible, highly adaptable, highly plastic beings. We are an animal that is capable of an enormous variety of ways of living, different places, different economic setups, different levels of technological development and innovation, different social structures, institutions. That's just who we are, right? We just have we just are this non-fixed animal that can build its own niche culturally and institutionally. And the idea that our evolved psychology, or the imprint on our psychology that the Pleistocene environment has left on our minds, right? Kind of like 2 million years ago, or a couple 100,000 years ago, is so strong that it means that we are forever condemned to living in groups of 50 people. I think it's just clearly ridiculous. Quite the opposite. What history shows is that we are hugely malleable and we can live in all sorts of ways. And what it also shows is that almost always human beings have benefited from expanding networks of cooperation, becoming more inclusive and egalitarian, all of which are things that are allegedly not permitted by the constraints that that keep our psychology shackled to an ancient environment that we no longer inhabit. So I think again, there are probably some constraints on how politics and society should function that come from the kind of animal that we are.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, it is a bad idea to set up society in a way that people can't live with their children, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. There seems to be an extremely strong desire to have children and to be close to them and to take care of them and to have families. Of course, that's a huge injustice in some sense, right? Because the privileges that children inherit from their parents, or the disadvantages that children inherit from their parents genetically, but also in the amount of care they receive, the things they learn from their parents. It's a huge inequality that is undeserved for the children. So many political movements and utopias have tried to abolish the family or moderate and weaken its importance. And that tends to be a very, very destabilizing idea. People just don't want it, right? Mm-hmm. And probably people don't want it because because our nature is such that we really, really care about our own children. And it's very, very difficult to eliminate that drive. Mm-hmm. There may also be some constraints, but this is already controversial. There may also be some constraints on human desire, motivation, propensity to engage in sharing and solidarity, right? Usually you see that people have a very, very hard time caring about an enormous amount of people, right? Usually we don't care so much. You know, any given individual doesn't care so much about more than, you know, a pretty tight circle of other human beings, which makes it kind of hard to establish certain political ideas that are based on highly demanding conceptions of solidarity and affection towards our fellow human beings, right? So if you want to build a society based on the idea that you need to love everyone the way that you love your kids, it's going to be very hard. Yeah. Right. So there may be some constraints. Also, some of these evolved constraints are not even moral. It's just like information processing capacities, right? If you want to build a society, and the way that you build that society requires all human beings to have an IQ of 200, not going to work, right? Yeah. Or to have perfect knowledge, or to have, or to very closely follow the axioms of rational decision theory. It's not going to work because humans are frail and irrational and short-sighted and so on and so on. And you need to take that into account. But in almost all cases, I think, in the majority of cases where people have tried to get from constraints posed by evolution on our psychology to any kind of meaningful, politically conservative conclusion, I think it's a huge leap. Either way, now that we live this way, that we do in fact live, right? The idea that we should return to an entirely different lifestyle that our grandparents had, that is no longer a conservative idea. That is a radical proposal to deeply change society. So the conservative fantasy of how to live to get there is not a conservative idea at all. It's a radical upheaval of society. So true conservatives, and I think you do see that in Burke and in Oakeshott, have usually said, no, change is fine, but it's more about, we need to be cautious about it. We shouldn't rush it. It's usually a bad idea to try to change society radically in the direction of some utopia that you cooked up in your mind. Yeah. And I think that's very different. So there is a kind of like rational conservatism in there, but it's very different from the actual conservative political movements that we see in the world today, which usually are not based on scientific facts, social scientific information, or a plausible account of human nature.
No, yeah, I don't know if you agree with this, but the way I tend to think about it is that, I mean, when it comes to this kind of conservatism or reactionary conservatism, let's say, people, I mean, have this idea that if society changes in particular ways, it will be bad. But curiously enough, the kind of conservatism they are usually talking about is not something that is, I don't know, thousands of years old. It's usually what they saw when they were young or a few decades old. I mean, and going back to, I don't know, traditional gender roles or something like that. So that's usually what they're talking about when they mean conservatism. So that really denounces the kinds of biases those sorts of people have.
I mean, there's at one point Nietzsche says that all philosophy is basically a kind of like autobiographical confession, right? And so people usually wrap up. Philosophy is basically like people who are highly verbally skilled try to dress up their own preferences and kind of childhood memories and nostalgia in something that sounds really fancy. Right. And so you have like, oh, well, you know, when I was a kid, my mother used to stay at home and take care of us. And I liked that a lot. So that's how society should be set up in general. Right. And it's often even fairly transparent. And I don't think that's a good idea. Or it's also like, you know, trans people confuse me. So let's make it legal or something. So I think that it's also worth emphasizing, of course, that conservative political outlooks do not have an exclusive claim to reactionary models, right? There is a kind of leftist reaction as well,
sure.
Right? And you see that in some leftist movements who say that we should go back to everyone's living off their own farm, right? And I say, okay, you do that. I'm gonna stay here. I'm good. You have your farm, and you can move to the outskirts of society. I'm gonna stay in Düsseldorf. It's pretty nice here. I'm gonna stay in civilization and modernity, and I have my all the perks of that. So there's a kind of reactionary model where people like romanticize the past before people had the corrupting forces of markets and money. And we want to return to that, and I think people are just grossly delusional about what that life would be like, how hard it would be, how pleasant it would be, and so you know, designing society in a way that's pleasant in a pleasant to live in, and also morally and politically appealing is very hard. And I think both radical conservatives and radical leftists are kind of like kidding themselves about how easy it would be. And indeed, like you said, often it's just also not really driven by careful reasoning and the relevant scientific information. It's driven by some sort of warm glow that people get when they think about the way society should be, but they don't really seriously think through what are the respective costs and benefits of living like that, and really look closely at how history actually worked and how people used to live. And so I think much of this stuff is unserious.
No, and you're totally right there. I mean, there are people both on the right and the left who have this sort of primitivist ideology where they think that sometimes we should go back to, for example, being farmers and living in rural areas and living off agriculture. And sometimes they even take it a step further and say that we should go back to hunter-gathering or something like that, supposedly because back then life was better in many different ways. And I mean, particularly on the left, that sounds a lot like Rousseau to some extent. I mean, the idea that before the rise of agriculture and stuff like that, society was better, and it's basically modern society that corrupts individuals and so on.
Exactly. I mean, we already talked about this common theme of it used to be great, now it sucks. And Rousseauism is kind of like, it's basically modern cultural criticism and social criticism, and like diagnosing the social pathologies starts with Rousseau in a certain sense, and most cultural critics have been Rousseauists in a very general sense ever since then, because they were based on they were operating on the assumption that on this Rousseauist assumption that there used to be a better way of living together that we have abandoned, that we've left behind, and we need to kind of reclaim it and rediscover it in a way. And then the disagreement is just about what that way of life used to be. And Rousseau had very, very peculiar ideas about humans are pretty much solitary individuals, and they meet to mate, but it's kind of like ad hoc. But this is like the noble savage kind of idea that humans are basically pleasant, and they're not strategic and calculative. They're kind of and it's society and culture and living together in larger groups that corrupts people. Has corrupted people, and now everyone's like chasing status and vanity and glory, and people trying to outcompete one another, and we are stuck in this kind of environment. I mean, there's some truth to that, right? That larger societies can generate side effects that we would rather do without. But in general, I think this idea is very, very common across the political spectrum, and it's important that we disabuse ourselves from that kind of narrative. And of course, a lot of people have said, I think Pinker was one of the big ones here, that kind of psychological predisposition to romanticize the past, that is only further exacerbated by the media environment that we live in, right? The media is just like a selection of the worst things that happen today, right? Accidents and disasters and so on and so on. But they never report when suicides go down. They never report when fewer people are hungry and in poverty. And so that we are living in a media environment that constantly seems to confirm this idea that things go to shit, and we need to return to some other vision. So I think a big part of the media is, in that sense, politically reactionary, regardless of its political flavor otherwise, because that kind of sensationalism is what sells, and it drives people insane.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you mentioned the media, because one of the words or terms that you hear a lot from the words of these conservative reactionary people is moral decadence, and then everything is a sign of moral decadence. So, for example, movies or recent movies are a sign of moral decadence. Postmodern or modern art is a sign of decadence. Modern architecture is a sign of decadence. I don't know, people on the street with different sexual orientations or gender identities, trans people are a sign of moral decadence, and then everything works to build these moral decadence theses.
Exactly. There are quite a few people who jump from, I don't really like Marvel movies, to civilization is ending.
Yeah.
Right? So I actually think Marvel movies are mostly bad. I mean, there have been some good ones, but I think mostly that whole franchise. Okay, but that's a different discussion, right? The idea is, and you see that in like whatever Ross Dowd had, for instance, but many other people have that idea that the current state of art and culture tells us something about the moral quality of our society right now.
Exactly.
And what we see in culture is it's mostly sequels, it's mostly old ideas, there's nothing new. Our creative energies are exhausted in some way. And that means that our moral character has been depleted as well. I think that's the idea, is that, you know, a truly morally virtuous society generates great art. And I don't think that works as an argument. I think you could make the case that there is something interesting about how art develops. The thing is that art and culture in general is highly dependent on innovation, right? In order to distinguish yourself as an artist and or as a musician, a painter, an architect, or a director, filmmaker, the main thing that you need to do is you need to do something new, right? You need to generate innovation. But of course, if at the same time we as a society keep an archive of past artistic performance, right? generating something new will become more difficult. You're kind of like constraining the space of what you can do. So people don't do sculptures anymore like the Pietà in the in Rome, right? It's one of the greatest works of art ever, but you can't do it anymore, not because it's bad or not because people are now incapable. They may be, I don't know, but just because it wouldn't be new, right? So what you have is just like an effect of on the one hand, a very, very thorough recollection of historical art combined with the imperative that art and to distinguish yourself as a great artist, you need to do something new. And there comes a point in time where the new things you can do, it becomes, you have fewer and fewer options. So you start to recombine old ideas, you start to parody old ideas, you start to do sequels, you start to be intertextual and so on and so on. And I think that's just an internal thing about the about culture. People may not like it. They may think that, oh, it would be so nice if we could do architecture like we used to do, if we could do visual arts like we used to do, classical music and so on and so on. And we could, but it would also be kind of boring, right? But I think that just doesn't tell you anything about the moral quality of society right now. It's its own thing. You may think it's regrettable and bad, but it doesn't tell you anything politically or morally interesting, except that when a lot of people have that kind of perception, is that art sucks and it's always the same and it's just postmodern remixes. That can become a political factor in its own right, where people say we need to do something entirely different. This society is decadent and corrupt and it deserves to die, and so let's make it happen.
So for the last part of the interview, I would like to ask you then about something that we've already touched on a little bit during our conversation, but in the book you also talk about the types, drivers, and institutions of moral progress that allow for the storage, transmission, and cumulative improvement of our normative infrastructure over time. That's the way you put it in the book. So tell us about that. What are some of the most important institutions that play a role here?
Yeah, exactly. So again, if we want to understand how moral change works, how moral progress works, if there is any, we need to have an idea of how the moral quality, so to speak, of human society could improve over time. So you kind of need to have an idea of how moral gains, moral developments are kind of stored in society, transmitted to the next generation, and then maybe improved upon. So you need to kind of like cumulative story. I think that's in general how humans function and how human social change works. I've over the past years, I've become a huge cultural evolution kind of guy, culture gene co-evolution. We think it's enormously interesting what people in theories of cultural evolution are doing and how that improves our understanding of human nature and how and human society and human morality and politics and all the rest of it. And I think that's the kind of basic framework that we should use in order to understand moral change and the structure of moral change and maybe even the direction of moral change. So again, I think that we basically what we need to look at is the cumulative moral capital that humans have generated, pass on to the next generation and improve upon, and what the mechanisms are that leads to that storage, that transmission, and that modification. And so in general, people are more likely to an arrangement, a social arrangement, other things being equal, is more likely to be stable and to be passed on and be transmitted to the next generation when people kind of find it acceptable for some reason, right? It doesn't mean that it's progressive. It can also be that in many cases you have social institutions that only benefit a small number of people in society, and the rest of society, the majority of people are kind of stuck in that situation because it's difficult to organize. It's kind of like a collective action problem that keeps people trapped in a situation. But in principle, there would be an improvement for the majority of people, but you just can't get that. But at the same time, there are it's a huge support for a norm or a value or an institution when people find it attractive for some reason, because it benefits them, because it gives them respect, because it allows them to thrive, because it provides more liberties, more freedoms, and so on and so on. And so I think that's kind of the right way of thinking about moral change and moral progression, is to think about, okay, what are the mechanisms of storing our moral infrastructure? What are the mechanisms that regulate the transmission of our moral infrastructure from one generation to the next? And are there maybe filters in that transmission that are not morally indifferent, right? So basically, people will, when they can, prefer to live in a society where they are better off, where they have more liberties, where they are treated more equally, where they have more influence on society and how their society functions, and more participation in their institutions, where they are not disenfranchised, discriminated against, oppressed, murdered, and so on and so on. Doesn't always work that way, obviously, but there is this push in the direction of moral improvement. And once you have, once you get to hop on a certain kind of social trajectory, these developments become mutually reinforcing. It still takes a long time, and it's very imperfect, it's very slow, it's very frustrating. And like we said, there's never any guarantee that it will work out a certain way. But I think there are these forces that bias social transmission in a certain direction of being morally morally better, of kind of like an ameliorative direction. And I think it's useful to study what these mechanisms and these institutions are. And so suppose that you have a society that uses extremely cruel and kind of arbitrary punishments to sanction minor norm transgressions, right? So you do something that's not that harmful to society at large, but you get an extremely cruel death penalty or something like that imposed on you. That's going to create a force where people say, I don't want that. I would rather, for society to develop in a different direction, I would rather leave this place. Oh, I've heard of this other place where they don't do that, but where I have better rights, where I can live more according to my preferences, and people won't oppress me and take my stuff or kill me. That's going to create some pressure in the direction of society developing like that. But it's, like I said, it's frustrating, it's slow, it's difficult. There are no guarantees. It takes a long time. But in principle, there are these mechanisms, and once you get to the next level, that will then be stored in our accumulated cultural moral capital, and the subsequent generations can then improve upon even further. Examples for that in recent history, but also looking back further into the past.
Okay, so I have one last question then. So do we have a good understanding of what causes moral progress? I mean, what are the factors that play a role here?
I mean, it's probably going to be somewhat disappointing. I mean, it's a bit of a lame answer to say that whatever the story is going to be, it's not going to be like an easily identifiable cause. It's not going to be a monocausal story. But the basic framework, I think, that we should use for thinking about it, and this is an idea that I'm that I find very attractive, which is this idea that we have a combination of moral developments in tandem with or in convergence with social, institutional, technological, economic, and political development. So this all goes together. Basically, what we call moral progress and moral development is largely driven by a scaling up of cooperative arrangements, right? So basically, human societies, human groups grow, right? We start from just small families, tribes, and bands. And the history of humanity is basically, very, very broadly speaking, the history of increasing group size and scaling up cooperative arrangements. Yeah. Building new normative infrastructure to deal with or to develop cooperative solutions to how we live together. That, and there are all sorts of feedback loops between that and technological innovation, economic development, and increasing economic prosperity, and the political structures that we build in order to organize that. Liberalism is basically a response to societies growing and becoming more diverse, such that certain ideologies diverge, clash, and they need to sort it out, right? And then it's liberalism is a compromise that we say, well, we can't really figure out which of us is right on transubstantiation, right? Is it the Protestants or the Catholics? Seems very, very hard to philosophically figure out the metaphysics of the Holy Spirit or whatever. At the same time, it's kind of a nuisance that we keep killing each other all the time, right? It would be much, much, much more attractive if we could not kill each other and instead engage in trade and make everyone's lives go better. And that creates a pressure in the direction of a certain type of moral innovation, which is certain freedoms of conscience and religious orientation in society, and reduction of conflict due to really made up groups, right? I'm Protestant, you're Catholic, you're Hindu or whatever. Yeah. And likewise, once you get on that path, right, you also create markets, you create scientific innovation, you create the corresponding institutions that double down on scientific innovation, free inquiry, universities, education, dialogue between philosophers, scientists, and so on and so on. You get more experiments, more observation that feeds back into technology, that feeds back into economic prosperity. Once you have urban living, people will want to live in cities more because they would rather not toil the fields and have to kick up 90% of their harvest to some idiot landlord who did nothing. They are going to want to move to cities and work in trade and crafts and academia and technology and so on and so on. Once you have that, you have greater anonymity, more people are going to do whatever, they're going to ask for even more liberties. And at the end, you have huge cities where you have gay quarters, and you're going to have Chinatown, and you're going to have, that kind of like modern life. But it tends to be a pretty good idea, right? So I think basically when we look at history, we see that kind of progressive story of greater inclusion, greater equality tends to be a good idea. But fundamentally, that is a story of the feedback between technology, the economy, and the cooperative structures that we scale up in order to allow all of that to happen. And I think that's what moral progress is about.
Great. So the book is again Moral Teleology, a theory of progress. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview, and also a link to our first interview, of course. Would you like to tell people again where they can find you online?
On Amazon. I have a book forthcoming. It already appeared in German and in Spanish. It's going to come out in I don't know, all the major world languages this year and in early 2024. It's called The Invention of Good and Evil, a world history of morality. And it tells this story of how moral change works in 7 chapters, starts 5 million years ago, and then 500,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, 50 and 5, up into the present, and kind of like the culture wars and all these sorts of discussions. That's something that many people that listen to your podcast will be interested in. Otherwise, you can find me on the Utrecht University website and on hannosauer.com. And there is a bit of information on papers that I wrote or talks that I've given and books that I've written. And yeah, please check it out.
Great. I'm very much looking forward to your next book. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erge Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eikeland, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Holt Ericbud, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Gressis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alni Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.